Welcome back to another chess game analysis video. Since you guys normally like when I analyze my own games for the channel, I decided to show this very nice game that I played in a club tournament, and it features a very strange and interesting opening idea, but an even more interesting and illustrative endgame technique that I think you can learn a lot from, and I also learned a lot from when analyzing this game. So just let's dive into the game. My opponent opened with g4. And I know some Grob gambit theory, but not a lot. I know the run for a counter gambit, which I like to play with black, but you hardly ever face the Grob, so you don't really get a lot of game experience, I think. My opponent played h3, defending the pawn, just not the main move, and it's not what you normally do in the Grob, but he actually played the opening after e6, knight f3, b6, and d4 pretty well, I think. And he didn't really get a disadvantage in the opening, which I think is alright. When you're playing the Grob, you normally need to be. You normally get a disadvantage in the opening, or you win the game on the spot. That's basically what can happen. c5, attacking the center. With e3, knight c6. Now, I just normally develop my pieces. I try to fianchetto my bishop and then pressure the d-pawn. Bishop b5, I think a nice move, pinning the knight. Bishop d7 development, knight c3, bishop d7, queen e2. So both players just normally develop their pieces, knight ge7. So far not a lot happened. Bishop d2 development. Black is already, according to the engine, a little bit better here in this position, but I personally didn't really find anything concrete here. I mean, the pushed pawns on the king side don't really look that nice, but there's not nothing that I can really exploit at this point. So I played a6, trying to bait him for taking the pawn. He took the pawn, which is a temporary pawn sacrifice. Bishop takes a6, rook takes a6, queen takes a6, and now you basically sacrificed an exchange and a pawn. But I hope you see how I can win back all the material and get an advantage of -4. So nearly a winning attack according to the engine. Knight b4 attacks the queen and threatens a fork, and the queen can't defend the fork. The a4 square is protected by the bishop, and the d3 square is protected by the knight itself, so the queen needs to retreat to f1. Not a good square for the queen. Knight takes e2 check, king e2, knight takes rook, queen takes rook, and now the queen is in the corner. Also quite a strange place for the queen. But also in this position, the engine just says you need to castle kingside and then you're basically winning. But I don't really see a concrete way of exploiting the position. I see the queen is a little bit misplaced, the king is not that nicely placed, the pawns look a little bit overextended, bishop is a little bit bad of a piece, but I didn't find anything concrete, so I just pushed the pawn c4, gaining more space. Now with b3 attacking the chain, castles, queen b2. I think especially the end game is very interesting in this game, so I'm going a little bit faster here in the middle game. Queen c2, rook b1, b5, solidifying the chain, b takes, and now b takes, which is a mistake. I think very interesting the way that the engine would play this. Queen takes c4 check. King needs to go back. Now we have b4, supported by the bishop and the queen, attacking the knight. Knight e2. Now we have bishop b5 activating the bishop and threatening checkmate. You need to defend this. Knight f to g1. And now you have just knight c6 defending the pawn. And the rook is going to come into the game. And the white pieces are just very passive. And according to the engine, this is even winning. I don't really see a concrete way of exploiting this yet, at least. Maybe I would come up with something in the game. I think just rook activation, and then this pawn is very strong, and the piece harmony is just not there for white. So this would have been a very nice middle game idea for me. Queen takes c4, but I just capture with the pawn, which seems very nice to hold this chain and create this isolated pawn, which can be an advantage for white, but also a disadvantage depending on how the game develops. My opponent here saw the chance of queen trading, queen b7, Rook b8 bring the rook into the game, but now he just trades everything off, and we reach this minor piece endgame with 3 minor pieces, and this should be equal. I'm gonna gain a little bit of an advantage later, and I'm gonna have some chances of winning the game. Let's see how the game develops. Here in this position, it's just basically a draw. I don't think any. You can play for a win, but according to the engine, there is not really a lot there. It's just an endgame. E4, bishop d6. The bishop was not nicely placed, so I'm going to improve it. Knight h4, bishop b4, now pinning the knight. And with knight takes d5, he basically trades off even more material and manages to trade off like one pawn and another piece. Knight takes d5, e takes d5, and now c3 in between move, bishop c1, and now you take back on d5. And now what happened is basically you get a bishop pair against knight and bishop, and you create this very nice pass c pawn. According to the engine, this is still equal, but I already felt quite comfortable that I could win with this pawn here, and there are going to be some more chances of actually converting this very nice pass pawn into a win. So we have knight g2, bring the knight back. I don't really know what the knight did on h4 anyway. h5 now trying to destroy the kingside pawn chain. f3 he doesn't take, but he holds the chain, which is correct. H takes. Bishop b5 check. Now activating the bishop. King d1. Bishop d3. Now a little bit of a trap here in this position. If you just try to, for instance, play some random move like a3, then c2 check. Mate would be very nice. Mate in one. The bishop pair and the pawn have a lot of nice like harmony in the position. So I think bishop d3 a good move and also a tricky one. My opponent, quite a strong player, realized that he has to defend against c2 checkmate. He played knight e3, also centralizing the knight. The knight wanted to go there anyway. I think either over here, or you could also reroute the knight over here. But this is definitely the correct way to play this position. Now king h7, now I try to activate the king. King e1, now he tries to go out of this checkmating ideas. c2 check, passing the pawn one square forward. Now the pawn is quite close to promotion. King f2, bishop c3, now attacking the pawn. Another pawn gets traded, the center d pawn. Knight takes d5, bishop takes d4. King g3, now we have f6. My idea, the positional idea here for black, if you manage to somehow trade off the dark square bishop, then the pawn can just pass. But until you can't really trade off the dark square bishop because the bishop can just capture, and then you can just go back to defending against c1 queen. So it's a very difficult position. I just somehow thought maybe with f6, g5, giving a check here, putting the bishop here, that he has to trade. There are some ideas. I thought in the game it was quite difficult for me, but the plan is of course to trade off this very nice defending bishop here, which seems like a weak piece, and it doesn't really do a lot, but it does its one job pretty well, and that's preventing me from promotion, because when I can't promote, I can't win with just two bishops. So f6, this is the idea, putting my pawns on dark square so that my dark square bishop is supported here. But as you're going to see in the game, I'm not going to have time for actually exchanging the bishop. Knight b4, attacking the bishop. Bishop g6. We have a4. Now he tries to push his own pawn here, the a pawn, which is a magnet pawn here on the rim of the board, which is quite a nice pawn. If you can push it further, it can actually cause some trouble as well. Bishop c4 attacking the knight. And now one of the very interesting endgame sequences start now. Knight d5 centralizing the knight would have been the correct way of playing this position. So that the knight kind of can maneuver a little bit better. It has more squares where it can go to. My opponent played knight c4, which is actually knight c6, which is actually a game-losing move interesting enough if you let the engine calculate deep enough. Because now you have bishop e8, which I found, knight a5, and now I took the pawn. I thought, okay, now I grabbed his pawn, I got the bishop pair against knight and bishop, I have this very nice pawn. But even with a lot of calculation, this position with perfect play should be a draw. So how could you have played this a little bit better? After knight a5, there is actually this very nice move, bishop f7, which when I first saw this move, I didn't really understand what it did. Let's just quickly see what happens if you don't do anything against it, because black has some very serious threats here. If you just do nothing like king g2, bishop d5, now restricting the knight, and you see the very nice harmony between the two bishops. If you again do nothing, one bishop restricts the knight and the other bishop attacks the knight, and knight is gone, you're down a piece, -8, 0-1, black wins. So as we saw, you can't just leave the knight on the rim of the board because he's gonna get trapped if you do nothing. So the best move in this position is to play knight b7, trying to activate the knight. But now again, not trying to grab the pawn or anything, just bishop e7, restricting the knight. You see the knight is pretty much restricted and doesn't have a lot of moves. Very hard to play this position. This bishop is constantly here. It can't be activated, otherwise you're just gonna have c1 queen, and the knight is restricted, so very hard position to play. Again, let's just take a look at if you do nothing. The best move here is a5. But if you just, let's say you move the knight back, knight a5, bishop d5 again, restricting the knight, and after like something like king f4, bishop d8 traps the knight again. So what other alternatives do you have? Let's say you do nothing, then again the knight, bishop d5, knight a5, bishop d8, knight gets trapped. So in all these variations, if you just wait around, or if you try to move the knight is just gonna get trapped. So the only move that the engine somehow finds to not immediately lose the knight is a5. But then bishop c4, and you see the knight is again restricted. If you just wait around, bishop a7, a6 traps the knight. So let's say you do nothing, the knight gets trapped. So it's a very hard position with this restricted knight. a6 is, according to the engine, the best move. You give the pawn back this way, bishop takes a6, and now the knight can come back into the game from knight a5. But then bishop d6 check, king f2, bishop c5 check, king g2 3 back, g5 now blocking the pawn chain, knight b3, and bishop a7. And now we up a pawn, and the bishop pair is very nice, the g pawn is very nice. The white king can never participate in the game because of the very nice bishop diagonals here. And this, according to the engine, is a one endgame. And I think even in a practical game, I would win this game by just approaching with the king slowly, because white can't really do a lot. It's very hard to play paralyzed position. Bishop can't move, king can't enter the game, the knight is restricted all the way because of the very nice diagonals of the bishop. So this is hard to play. So let's take a look back. Knight a5 could have been punished with bishop f7, and afterwards with bishop e7, which was hard to find, I think, for me. But the idea of restricting the knight is also a very nice endgame concept that you can take a look at as well in your own games. Maybe you find a way to restrict your opponent's knight, especially when you're having the bishop here. I think very illustrative here. Me, I'm just a terrible endgame player. I just saw a free pawn and I grabbed it, which now the position is again equal after knight c4, g5, solidifying the pawn chain, king g2, bishop b5, kicking the knight, and now again the second very interesting endgame position that arose in this game. Knight e3 holds a draw here, but my opponent played knight d2, which now allows bishop e3, knight moves again, trade of dark square bishops, and now bishop c4. And you see again the same topic, the knight, this time a little bit differently placed, but again very much restricted by the bishop. And you can To be a little bit faster, you can always see a knight and a bishop. If there are two squares in between, they dominate each other. So I can't move the bishop either. The knight, in a way, also dominates my bishop because the bishop can't move here either. But the problem just is that white's piece in this position is just a very restricted knight. And the only difference is basically I don't want to move my bishop, and he would like to move his knight in the position to somehow get some compensation and activity. So this is what happened. Bishop c4 restricting the knight. King f2 trying to activate the king. So this position is actually winning for black. And I played king g7, which is a blunder, and it draws the game, unfortunately. I'm going to show you how the game continued later on, but I'm just going to show you the winning idea for black in this position. It's king g7, which looks a little bit like, okay, you can activate the king like this or like this. For me personally king g6 looked a little bit more natural because the king also supports this pawn push, but king g7 actually wins the game. I'm going to show you later what happened in the game and why king g6 is actually a huge mistake. Here this position is just a Zugzwang position. The knight is restricted, the king can't do a lot. King e3, bishop d5, now keeping an eye on the pawn, so that the king can never really approach the bishop because the pawn is just going to fall. Knight e2, the king just slowly approaches. This is the very nice thing in endgame positions with Zugzwang and with like a very dominant position with this pawn here. You can just take your time with black, slowly approach with the king. f4, bishop e6, attacking the pawn. Now f5, blocking the pawn chain, bishop c4, attacking the knight. If the knight gets traded, c1 queen, so the knight again needs to be very passive, go back to c1. And now again you just approach, king e7. And this is a sequence that you don't really have to calculate that deeply, because you can just think like, there are no moves for white that really help him in this position. King e4, for instance, king d6 is just a Zugzwang position. So I think patience is very important in these kinds of endgames. You just need to realize that white's piece in this position, the knight on c1, is just very much restricted, can't move, the king can't really help. The pawns are on light squares, which is very nice because my bishop can always go to attack it, maybe like this. So you just can activate your king very slowly. White can't really do anything. You can try to win the c-pawn, but then the maneuver bishop f1, the c-pawn gets captured, but afterwards both of white's pawns get captured and you get this endgame. So you get this endgame bishop and two pawns against knight, which is completely winning. So this is just one of the lines that could happen after king g7. You just need to realize in these positions, patience is important, slowly improving the king. White can't really do a lot. And then at some point you're just going to win the pawns and then you're going to win the game. So king g7, brilliant move, and wins the game here in this position. But I played king g6, and we're going to see why this is actually a blunder that loses the game. He activates his king. King e3, f5, king d2, now trying to win the pawn. f4, king takes e2, bishop d5, and now I just thought again it's the same thing that I've shown you just a couple of seconds ago. I'm gonna win both of these pawns, he can't defend it, neither with king nor with knight, so I'm just gonna win both pawns, and I'm gonna win this game very easily. But he has knight d3, and I was like, can't you just take the pawn? Because the knight doesn't really protect the pawn, but the knight doesn't need to protect the pawn because the f-pawn in this position is tactically protected. Knight e5 just is a nice fork and wins the bishop. And that's why, very nuanced, I think, the king is badly placed on g6 because this fork is possible. It would have been better on g7. So the fork would not be possible and the bishop just grabs both pawns and it's an easy endgame. So this is very unfortunately, this knight d3, a very nice tactical way of preventing the pawns being captured. And now I realize that my king is badly placed here, so I moved it. But now, of course, he has knight e1, attacking defending the pawn. And now this is just a dead draw. King d5, king d3. I move the bishop, king c3. He just moves back and forth and he doesn't let my king enter the position. And here my opponent offered a draw after 53 moves, which I accepted. So the game ends in a draw. There were a lot of possibilities for me to win this game. So one of the possibilities was in this position taking with the queen in the opening and getting a very nice attacking idea. One of the ideas was actually here in this position, trapping the opposing knight. And one of the positions was king g7, here in the endgame winning with Zugzwang. So, I personally think that I definitely need to improve my endgame, and I hope this video kind of helps you understand some endgame principles better as well. My opponent defended very nicely, I think. He found, in the last couple of moves, the only move basically according to the engine that actually draws the game, and maybe in some respect he was lucky that I didn't find the best continuation, but that's chess. I mean, you kind of need to be happy with a draw at some point. And yeah, I think it was overall a very instructive and nice game. And this time a Grob opening with g4 first move. Maybe you try this in a blitz game as well. And hopefully you're back for some endgame studies. And this is one of the games that made me realize I definitely need to work on my endgame skills. So I hope this was illustrative for you and you learned something. If you want to see live chess gameplay, check out my Twitch, check out my Instagram, and see you in the next video. Bye.